Well, welcome everyone. I'm Tim Potts, Director of the Getty Museum, and delighted to see so many of you here for today's very important lecture by Professor Rose. I want to thank the Villa Council, who are a group of very dedicated supporters of the Department of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa, and it's they who support this program of an annual lecture, the Getty Villa Presents lecture by a distinguished practitioner in the field. So thank you to all of them. I also in particular want to thank Paul and Anissa Balson, who are members of that council, but also who funded the endowed senior curatorship of antiquities here at the Getty Villa. Let me say just a bit to introduce our very distinguished and prolific speaker, Brian Rose, who is one of the foremost renowned classical archaeologists of his generation, and who has done extraordinarily important work at a number of sites. He's the James B. Pritchard Professor of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum and was the museum's deputy director there from 2008 to 2011. He served as president of the Archaeological Institute of America from 2007 to 2011 and currently serves as the director of the Gordian excavations since 2013, and those excavations are ongoing. Gordian, of course, is the capital of the Phrygian kingdom in central Turkey. He's also, earlier than that, before that, he had worked for many years from 1988 at Troy, where he was and is the head of the post-Bronze Age excavations through 2012. He's also done extraordinary work and really very important work in offering pre-development and educational training for armed forces personnel for their work in Iraq and Afghanistan to help emphasize the cultural heritage awareness and protection of those very important ancient cultures. And indeed, I'm sure that will come into, at some point, to his lecture to you today. He's been the recipient of many awards. He has received the Gold Medal of the Archaeological Institute of America. He has had fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, the American Academy in Berlin, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. And in 1994, he and his collaborator, Manfred Kaufmann, received the Max Planck Prize of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And in 2012, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is a corresponding member of the German Archaeological Institute and the Austrian Archaeological Institutes. So, as you will have gathered, he is extremely distinguished in his field, and we could have no better speaker today to talk to you about archaeology, museums, and war strategies for the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rose.
Thank you, Tim, and my thanks to all of you for coming today. It's always an honor to be a guest at the Getty. This will be very much an autobiographical talk, focused in particular on the unexpected detours that occur in our scholarly careers. Even though most of us early in our careers form a fairly clear idea of where we think our professions will take us, we're invariably led in intellectual directions we could never have anticipated. And these in turn require us to reinvent ourselves as both person and scholar. In my case, that reinvention came during the last 20 years with the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. I was a fairly typical Mediterranean archaeologist before the wars started, digging at the site of Troy in northwestern Turkey. The wars I studied had occurred at least 2,000 years ago. And I never imagined that I'd be dealing with the military in combat zones, nor that I would simultaneously be pulled into another set of battles, one involving the antagonistic relationship that existed between archaeologists and curators, and the other linked to the return or repatriation of antiquities to Mediterranean and Near Eastern countries. All of these issues came to the fore during my work with the Archaeological Institute of America, or AIA, over the last 20 years. And the AIA forms the backdrop of much of what I treat in this talk, which explores the challenges that face art historians, archaeologists, and museum professionals in what has become a new era of cultural stewardship for us. I begin with a discussion of the ways in which the past now dominates the present, followed by an overview of the Penn Museum's recent involvement with cultural heritage destruction and preservation programs in conflict zones. This leads back to the subject of museums and repatriation requests in an age of increasing nationalism. I close with some words on the future of archaeological projects in the Near East and on the current relationship between archaeologists and curators. It's difficult for us to realize the impact of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria on art historians and curators who deal with the art and material culture of antiquity. Let's look at a cross-section of academic conferences dealing with antiquity during the last 20 years. One finds that the same words continually appear: war and destruction, conflict and battle, trauma and violence. This is true in scholarly publications as well, where the same themes are highlighted. Books such as Combat Trauma and the Greeks, Conflict in Ancient Greece and Rome, War as Spectacle, and Landscapes of Violence are now the norm rather than the exception. One of the most interesting parallel developments is a compression of the time periods separating antiquity from the contemporary world, so that the two are now regularly viewed side by side. Books such as Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, and Ajax in Iraq are cases in point and demonstrate that it's sometimes easier for us to understand modern wars by viewing them through the lens of ancient conflicts, especially the Trojan War. The latest example of this phenomenon occurred last month at USC, when their Trojan statue was transformed into a commentator on the current conflict in the Middle East. In new programs such as Theater of War, this is carried even further. Ancient and modern combat trauma are interlinked, with Iraq and Afghan war veterans reading from ancient Greek plays about the Trojan War to highlight the timelessness of post-traumatic stress. We've recently created a similar type of program at the Penn Museum in tandem with the nearby Veterans Administration Hospital, in which we present ancient material culture linked to war, combat, and trauma that is repurposed for modern veterans. Our goal in this program, entitled Eternal Soldier, is to demonstrate to veterans that their emotional, spiritual, and psychological experiences are part of a diachronic continuum that reaches back to antiquity. At the same time, the objects in our collections become tied to the healing process for the soldiers who view them, which is a very different role from the one in which we traditionally cast them. The late Bronze Age letters from Egyptian soldiers stationed in Canaan, for example, highlight the heat and desolation of the faraway bases to which they had deployed. And a brief text panel can make these letters immediately relevant to the veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars, as we have done in our Canaan and Israel gallery. You can easily read the letter, "I am dwelling in Damnationville with no supplies. Those that I brought are gone. I spend the day eyeing the road home with longing. The heat here never lets up." Those words were written in the 14th century BC, but they could just as easily have been composed by an American soldier in Iraq in 2006. Tied to this telescoping of ancient and modern warfare is the issue of triumphal imagery, wherein ancient iconographic themes convey the same message of victory, albeit in a different configuration. One of the most Famous scenes on Trajan's column in Rome, for example, includes a group of Roman soldiers holding the severed heads of captive Dacians, the residents of ancient Romania, which are presented to the emperor as a sign of the Romans' triumph on the battlefield. One can easily find photos of Taliban and ISIS soldiers holding the severed heads of their enemies to the camera, at times posing in exactly the same manner as Trajan's soldiers. It's no longer uncommon to see such scenes placed together as a way of demonstrating that even after 2,000 years, the severed human head is still a war trophy. The same conflation of past and present is apparent in our war memorials, and two examples succinctly illustrate this point. After the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, the bodies of the dead soldiers were interred in a monumental burial mound, the primary decoration of which was a list of the names of the Athenians and their allies who had died in the battle. In essence, casualty lists. A similar solution, of course, was adopted by the designers of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington and the World Trade Center Memorial in New York, where it is the names of the dead that dominate the design. 10 years after Marathon, at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartan commander Leonidas reportedly shouted at the Persians, "Molon labe," or "come and take them," referring to the weapons of the Spartans. The same phrase was adopted by Texan soldiers during the battle between Texas and Mexico in 1835, 1 year before the Alamo's destruction. This was depicted in a mural added to the Gonzalez Memorial Museum, with the Mexicans transformed into latter-day Persians. It reappeared during the 2021 storming of the US Capitol, when some of the rioters donned Spartan helmets and carried a modified version of the "come and take it" flag derived from the cry of Leonidas in 480 BC. This "come and take it" or "molon labe" is arguably the most elastic and long-lived of the phrases associated with armed conflict in antiquity. If one were to pinpoint a single moment when much of the world became conscious of the interface between war and archaeology, it would probably be the looting of the Archaeological Museum in Baghdad in 2003. Although estimates vary, it seems likely that around 15,000 objects were stolen, many of which figured among the most important examples of ancient art surviving from Mesopotamia. Occurring at the same time was the large-scale plundering of archaeological sites throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, which transformed them into landscapes resembling the craters of the moon. It's impossible to determine which objects were stolen from these sites, and the problem has been accelerated by the civil war in Syria, which still continues in some parts of the country. Compounding the problem of cultural heritage protection is a staggering rise in historical iconoclasm, wherein the surviving testaments to pre-Islamic cultures in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan are systematically being erased. The most well-known examples include the bombing of the Temple of Baal in Palmyra, the destruction of the Hatra statues in the Mosul Museum, and the defacing of the apotropaic Lamassu figure in Nimrud, although the damage has been so widespread that we may never be able to compile a complete list. Iconoclasm has been a regular feature of human society since the beginning of recorded history, but we're now seeing a manipulation of historical memory on an unprecedented scale, with landscapes defined more by absence than by presence. Indeed, in the case of the colossal Buddha statues at Bamiyan in central Afghanistan, destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, the empty shell, once occupied by the Buddha, stands as a more powerful testament to the savagery of iconoclasm than any image or word could convey. All of these issues were brought home to me 20 years ago, in that I was in my second year as president-elect of the Archaeological Institute of America. The reports of the destructions of museums, libraries, and archaeological sites throughout Iraq and Afghanistan were now being brought directly to me, and I was expected to respond proactively. Nothing in my training had prepared me for such a response. I had little knowledge of the cultural heritage of Central Asia, no understanding of either the military or of international diplomacy, and I had attended a Quaker college where nonviolence was preached every day. Yet something had to be done. Looting at historic sites and cultural institutions throughout these areas had increased dramatically, as had iconoclasm. Bringing archaeologists from Iraq and Afghanistan to the next annual meeting of the AIA in San Francisco in 2004 seemed to be the best course of action, and funds quickly offered by the Packard Humanities Institute made it possible. Donnie George, the director of the Iraq Museum, agreed to come, as did Abdul Wasi Firouzi, the director general of the National Institute of Archaeology in Afghanistan, here circled in red. In the course of the conference, Dr. Firouzi described the campaign of iconoclasm promoted by the Taliban, the rampant looting of museums and archaeological sites throughout the country, and the sale of increasing numbers of undocumented Afghan and Iraqi antiquities on eBay. In particular, he lamented the fact that the soldiers deployed in Afghanistan had little or no sense of the cultural heritage of the region. These comments put the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan in a new perspective. We realized that we needed a program where an archaeologist would go to US military bases and teach the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan to the soldiers who were preparing to deploy to those countries. Since US soldiers had become the primary security agents at both archaeological sites and museums, we thought that such briefings would promote a greater comprehension of and respect for the cultural heritage of the areas in conflict. I hope that this in turn would play a role in decreasing the number of antiquities smuggled out of the country and onto the art market. I had no idea how to do any of this, and inaugurating such a project was easier said than done. The AIA and academics in general had no clear channels of communication to the military then. Archaeologists have periodically interfaced with the US armed forces in the past, especially during World War II, when they helped to pinpoint and safeguard archaeological sites and identify and repatriate looted works of art. These individuals, of course, were the so-called monuments officers, some of whom became directors of America's leading art museums. But there had been very little interaction between the AIA and the military since that time. And during the Vietnam War, the level of mistrust and animosity between academics and the military increased dramatically. In other words, for over 3 decades, academics and the military had not really been speaking to each other except in anger. Nevertheless, after 9 months of trying, and with the aid of Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, our program was approved by the US Central Command, and it continued for 13 years at Fort Bliss, Camp Lejeune, and Fort Dix, among many others, and occasionally in the field in Iraq at Talil Air Base, and in Afghanistan at Kabul and Ghazni. Once I had secured approval, I had to find lecturers who could give the briefings, and this highlights the importance of flexibility. Academics are accustomed to lecture tours in which we're given generous introductions, taken out to dinner, and sometimes put up in hotels that are quite luxurious. And thank you to the Getty for doing all of these things for me. This doesn't happen in the Army. Training schedules can change suddenly, and one has to react rapidly and diplomatically to alterations in the timing and locations of the briefings. Finding archaeologists who were willing to adapt to this routine proved problematic, and I finally turned to archaeology professors who had served in the Vietnam War, such as Paul Zemansky, Al Leonard, and Jim Wright. I also didn't anticipate that we would be expected to speak on Iraqi and Afghan cultural heritage from antiquity to the present, including society and religion. When one of the soldiers asked me what she could expect to find in terms of regional variations in Islam in northern Afghanistan, I noted that this was beyond my expertise. And she replied, but this is the only unit on culture in pre-deployment training. So we expanded the range of the lectures accordingly, at least to the best of our abilities. We spent a lot of time on the basics of architectural and object conservation, outlining the emergency conservation measures with which troops need to be familiar when they are the first to enter museums or libraries that have been struck by rockets. What do you do when you enter a museum whose water pipes have burst, the shelves supporting antiquities have collapsed in the rocket attack, and everyone has left? Knowing the fundamentals of conservation can rescue the objects in a museum that are considered sacred by the surrounding community, which is obviously fundamental to winning support in those communities. Some of our sessions were held at the Penn Museum so that we could train soldiers in the galleries with the same kinds of objects they might encounter in the field. Similar troop lecture programs have been adopted in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Bulgaria, among others, and we continue to urge the adoption of such programs for the military police in Iraq and Afghanistan. All of the lessons taught in our cultural heritage training sessions are repeated on decks of playing cards that are distributed to soldiers deploying abroad. This was the brainchild of Lori Rush, archaeologist at Fort Drum. She realized that troops would often deploy to areas with no electricity, and they would play cards in their off hours, so they might as well learn while doing so. One of our intentions was to communicate the sense of loss experienced by Iraqis and Afghans when their monuments are destroyed in combat. One of the cards, for example, features the Statue of Liberty with the caption, "How would we feel if someone destroyed her torch?" which conveys this point very strongly. I began to view these lessons in a new light when I was sent to southern Afghanistan in 2012 to do some training sessions in cultural heritage protection. On my last day in Ghazni in southern Afghanistan, demonstrations erupted throughout the country in response to the burning of the Quran by a minister in Florida, which had been posted on YouTube and had received international publicity. Some of the demonstrations turned violent, and several UN personnel and Afghan civilians were killed that day. For all of us, I think the burning of books occupies the same general sphere as the Taliban's destruction of the colossal Buddha statues in central Afghanistan 23 years ago. Both books and icons often constitute the nucleus of a community. It's therefore not surprising that they are so frequently the targets of attacks by conquerors, by those who follow a different religion, or by those who seek to wound a community for whatever reason. This kind of iconoclastic fervor, as I've said, has been a component of society since the beginning of recorded history 5,000 years ago. And we often ask how we can make a difference. Perhaps the most potentially productive course of action lies in children's education, which is a mode of outreach that many professors have typically shied away from. The sanctity of cultural property and the injustice of iconoclasm are themes that can and should be integrated into children's curricula year after year, and we need to be a part of that planning. This alone will not bring an end to iconoclasm, but it may cause one fewer book to be burned and one fewer person to be killed in response to that burning. Finding a way to communicate the loss of cultural heritage in a memorial has become increasingly difficult because the nature of the adversity commemorated by the monument has changed so radically. There are no longer necessarily two sides to a conflict, nor any clear victors, which means that the selection of appropriate words and images has stymied the designers of such memorials. Let's take the example of the memorial planned to commemorate the Kent State University shooting in 1970, when 4 students were shot by members of the Ohio National Guard, just over 50 years ago yesterday. What words and images are appropriate for such a memorial? In the end, the sculptor George Siegel chose to filter it through the lens of antiquity, using the biblical analog of Abraham and Isaac. But even this was considered too controversial, and the memorial was eventually moved to Princeton. There appears to be a growing conviction, in fact, that figural imagery can no longer adequately express the horror of the subject in question, and we can see this in the designs developed for the World Trade Center Memorial. One of the most potent solutions involved the use of the surviving ruined facade as the centerpiece of the memorial's design. Athens did the same thing on the Acropolis after the Persian Wars, when the first Parthenon was showcased as a ruin to highlight the attack of the Persians in 480. Similar solutions, of course, were adopted by Berlin, Hiroshima, and Coventry following World War II. In the end, the surviving fragments of the building were assembled in a warehouse and distributed as the primary components of memorials to cities throughout the country. These tie into the issue of power and lead one to question how power can be measured. Some would argue that the ultimate indication of power occurs when an object is divided into a number of pieces, and each piece still possesses the same level of power as the original object. The relics of saints operated this way during the Middle Ages, and the pieces of the World Trade Center are no different. In a way, these are our relics. Many of these regional monuments are intended to be touched, which is another striking feature of war memorial design within the last 50 years, as two very different examples demonstrate. One of them, in Berlin's Jewish Museum, is a sculptural installation by Menashe Kadishman entitled Shalaket, or Fallen Leaves. One of the museum's largest rooms is filled with over 10,000 circular iron plates in which are cut open-mouthed faces suggestive of screaming. The sound of visitors walking on the exhibit, which they're encouraged to do, creates a rattle as they fight to maintain their balance. In essence, visitors are cast in an active role as perpetrators of the violence evinced by the monument. To an extent, one witnesses a similar phenomenon, in Saddam Hussein's triumphal parade route in central Baghdad, wherein Iraqi soldiers were intended to walk on captured Iranian helmets embedded in the parade route's concrete path, the design having been inspired by victory imagery in 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamia. In both situations, one literally walks on heads as a trigger to memory, with sound and touch as important as sight. It is the power of images, and particularly the power of commemorative sculpture and architecture, that has stimulated a range of forceful reactions during the last 20 years, ushering in a new obsession with political iconoclasm. In some cases, it's abundantly clear which political monuments should be documented and protected, but at other times the situation is more ambiguous. What of the recent destruction of statues of men now branded as dictators, such as those of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, Lenin in Berlin, and Marcos in the Philippines, among many others? What of the statues of Confederate Army officers in the parks of American cities? Should we consider these as cultural property? And should they consequently be preserved? For me, these are historical documents, and I would argue against the destruction of history under any circumstances. If these are images linked to racism, ethnic hatred, sexism, homophobia, or other injustices, I would install them in a museum with explanatory text panels, but I wouldn't destroy them. The residents of the countries in question obviously feel differently, and in the end, it's their decision to make. I dealt with this issue when I was lecturing in southern Iraq at the airbase near the site of Ur, and the archaeology supervisor for the district showed me a building that was labeled as the house of the biblical prophet Abraham. He explained that the house was built from scratch in 1999 because the Pope had announced his intention to visit pilgrimage sites in the Near East during the Vatican's Jubilee year of 2000. And Saddam Hussein believed that if he built a house for Abraham in Ur, the Pope would travel to Iraq and Saddam's stature would rise as a consequence. The supervisor, standing at the right, wanted the building destroyed because it was a component of Saddam's political propaganda. I explained that this building was now part of the history of the site, and while a sign should certainly be erected explaining the propagandistic role of the building, it shouldn't be destroyed. Although he disagreed strongly with my argument, which the State Department photographer captured in this image that you see on upper right, and you can tell his reaction from his body language, the building nevertheless still stands as far as I know. The same supervisor also highlighted the post-2003 currency of Iraq, which features a miniature version of the figural scene on the law code of Hammurabi, where the king receives the wisdom of the sun god Shamash. The Iraqi pride in having been the source of the first written law code overrides all strictures against the representation of pagan gods, and it's emblematic of the rising nationalism that we've witnessed following the breakup of the Soviet Union in particular. Countries searching for a new identity have reached back to antiquity to find a heroic figure around whom the entire community can unite. The Armenian hero Haik, as you see on upper left, or Alexander the Great in the Republic of Northern Macedonia are two more cases in point. Even in America, we've witnessed this phenomenon of rising nationalism. After the 9/11 attacks, American flags grew exponentially in size, becoming so large that it was no longer easy to carry them. Often coupled with this rise in nationalism has been stronger antiquities legislation, both in the US and abroad, as well as more aggressive attempts to secure the repatriation of antiquities looted from the country of origin. When these antiquities are returned, they are often treated like heroes coming home after a period of wandering. The catalog of repatriated antiquities in Italy in 2007-8, for example, was entitled Nostoi, the Greek word for the journeys of the Homeric heroes who returned to their homes following the Trojan Wars. The repatriated antiquities, in other words, were considered analogous to war-weary veterans. On the internet, the Athenian Acropolis marbles in the British Museum now speak in first person. I am Greek and I want to go home. This is, in my experience, a new phenomenon in the larger scheme of repatriation advertising. It is expressed even more powerfully in the new Acropolis Museum in Athens, where empty spaces in the exhibit represent the Parthenon reliefs now in London that have been requested for repatriation. In essence, a case of absence as argument. I dealt with the issue of repatriation a decade ago in a situation that demonstrated to me the importance of flexibility, creativity, and communication for museum curators. The repatriation requests came from Turkey in regard to a group of early Bronze Age gold jewelry that the Penn Museum had acquired in 1966. The negotiations regarding the fate of the gold lasted for 11 months until September of 2012. And I realized how significantly repatriation requests have changed during the 21st century. The UNESCO Convention of 1970 certainly entered into our discussions, but I found that it was regarded by Turkey as irrelevant, and new models had to be proposed in the quest for a solution. The Penn Museum's Trojan gold consists of 24 pieces of jewelry dating to around 2400 BC, similar in style to Heinrich Schliemann's Treasure of Priam, and therefore commonly linked to Troy. In the initial publications, written in the late 1960s by George Bass, then a curator at the Penn Museum, he highlighted the difficulty in pinpointing the provenience of the jewelry and was not convinced that all the objects in the hoard were from the same site. He noted their strong similarities to the early Bronze Age jewelry of Troy in northwest Turkey, Polyokni on Lemnos, which is part of Greece, and Ur in southern Iraq. The Penn Museum's purchase of this assemblage in 1966 prompted a series of discussions that ultimately led to the formulation of the Pennsylvania Declaration in 1970, a document intended to prohibit future acquisitions by the museum of unprovenanced antiquities. A few months later, but still in 1970, UNESCO formulated a convention designed to prevent the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. This has typically been viewed as a line in the sand by archaeologists. In other words, if an antiquity was acquired or published prior to 1970, its return would not be requested by the country where it was discovered. If its existence was first attested after 1970 and it had no known provenance, it may well be requested for return or repatriation by the country where it was found. In other words, from that point on, 1970 was treated as a fixed line in the sand by many regarding requests for the repatriation of antiquities. The Penn Museum's Troy Gold was subsequently published and exhibited in a variety of books and journals, especially after the rediscovery in 1993 of Schliemann's Treasure of Priam in the basement depots of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Despite the increased publicity for all things Trojan at that time, there were no claims for the repatriation of Penn's gold. In 2009, however, I brought two archaeometallurgists from Germany to examine the gold. A few particles of soil were found lodged inside a tiny loop of gold on the back of one of the gold pendants, and neutron activation analysis revealed that the composition of the soil in the Penn Museum gold was consistent with the soil in the plains of Troy. Ernst Pernitzka, the lead scientist, said that it was not proof of provenance, but it was a good bet that Penn's enigmatic collection had come from somewhere in the area of Trojan influence, Turkey, Greece, or Southeastern Europe. This assessment appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer in January of 2010. There was considerable discussion before we released the scientific testing results to the newspaper, but our mission is to inform the public about the archaeological research that we conduct, so the decision to release the results was clear. Toward the end of 2011, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism contacted the Penn Museum regarding the potential transfer of the gold to Turkey based in large part on Pernitzka's scientific analysis. A series of discussions then took place between the University of Pennsylvania and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism during the course of the next 11 months. When the discussions began, we pointed out that the gold had been purchased 4 years before the UNESCO Convention of 1970 had been formulated. The officials from the ministry indicated that they were now following the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, and they compared their claim to the Trojan gold to the NAGPRA law in the US, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. There were 3 reasons why we wanted to find a way to secure a compromise in this situation. Penn had been working in Turkey continuously since 1950, primarily at the site of Gordian. The Penn Museum serves as the headquarters of the American Research Institute in Turkey, and we had written the Pennsylvania Declaration even before the UNESCO Convention of 1970 was drawn up. So the Declaration and archaeological ethics had become a strong component of our identity as a museum. The Penn Museum director at that time, Richard Hodges, initially proposed a 30-year loan, which was rejected by the ministry. I highlighted the fact that Greek and Near Eastern jewelry of the mid to late 3rd millennium BC exhibits a kind of international style tied to long-distance trade networks that crossed both Asia and the Aegean. Jewelers moved back and forth throughout this region in antiquity, which makes it difficult to link unprovenance jewelry to a specific site. The original provenance of the treasure is likely to be the Northeast Aegean, but whether the provenance was in an area now contained within the modern borders of Greece or Turkey could not be determined with certainty. This argument, too, was initially unsuccessful, although after further discussion, we came to an agreement on an indefinite loan, which was the farthest that the university was willing to go, since the precise provenance of the gold could not be established with 100% certainty. What this meant was that the Troy gold would go indefinitely to Turkey. In return, the ministry promised strong support for the continuation of Penn's excavations at Gordian near Ankara for as long as we like. Also promised was the loan to Penn of the assemblage from the Midas Mound tomb at Gordian for an exhibit of 1 year's duration. The tomb was excavated by Penn in 1957 and yielded one of the most impressive royal funerary assemblages in Anatolia. That exhibit, entitled The Golden Age of King Midas, opened at the Penn Museum in 2006 with over 120 objects borrowed from 4 museums in Turkey, and nearly 45,000 visitors came to see it. It's worth noting that Troy and its antiquities have been cast in a rather prominent role in recent political discourse concerning Turkey's entry into the European Union. Some have argued that because the Turkish site of Troy is the focus of the Iliad, and the Iliad lies at the foundation of the European cultural tradition, then Turkey, by extension, should be admitted to the European Union. This may have played a role in Turkey's request for the Penn Museum gold, although such claims from Turkey are not uncommon. I suppose what surprised me most about all of these activities was the absence of the UNESCO convention in the discussions. The ministry no longer considered 1970 to be the line in the sand that I had always been taught it had become, nor was I expecting a reversion to the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, but even this does not seem to be a fixed line. Turkey has called for the return of the marble statue of the old fisherman from Aphrodisias, which entered the Pergamon Museum in Berlin in 1905, 1 year before the Ottoman Antiquities Law was formulated. This suggests that, at least in the case of some countries, we've passed beyond the relative security that the UNESCO Convention offered to museums with antiquities collections, and we're now in what I would call uncharted territory. That applies as well to archaeological projects in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Since so many Near Eastern countries are now considered too potentially dangerous for fieldwork, the number of archaeologists who choose to specialize in that region of the world will no doubt eventually decrease, even though the number of graduate applications in ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history rose significantly after the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, at least at Penn. These are times of transition, with the archaeological community gradually recognizing that the codes and conduct that have been in place for a century will no longer prevail in the countries in which we work or the world in which we live. For the student of archaeology today, then, the development of skills in diplomacy and creativity is just as important as those in archaeological techniques. And what of the relationship between curators and archaeologists, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk? We have a long way to go, but this has improved noticeably. And again, I'll relate my own experience with the issue. My awareness of the extent of the antipathy between the two groups goes back to a conference on cultural property held at the New York Public Library in 2006. The discourse between representatives of the AIA and the Association of Art Museum Directors, or AAMD, was unusually angry, with some members of the AIA arguing that the purchase of undocumented antiquities led to an acceleration in the looting of archaeological sites, while some in the AAMD maintained that countries could no longer be trusted to safeguard the antiquities contained within their borders, citing the destruction of the Buddhas by the Afghan Taliban as an example. Many of these arguments were summarized shortly thereafter in James Cuno's book, Who Owns Antiquity?, wherein he spoke of the rise in nationalism in connection to the spike in requests for repatriation and argued that antiquities are the cultural property of all humankind. The New York Public Library Conference highlighted for me how wide the gulf between archaeologists and museums had become, and clearly something needed to be done. Around 2010, the AIA began sponsoring a series of workshops with representatives from both AAMD and AIA, meeting out of the public eye. No topics would be off the table, but passion would be tempered by diplomacy, and we would search for potential areas of agreement and collaboration. From what I can see, most of the antipathy has stopped. There are undoubtedly many reasons for this, but one is that the destruction of cultural heritage in the Middle East and Central Asia during the last 20 years has demonstrated to all of us the necessity of working together. Especially important are the AAMD's recent guidelines recognizing the 1970 UNESCO Convention as a threshold for future antiquities acquisitions. Although, as I have indicated, not every country recognizes the convention as a firm basis for repatriation negotiations. It's also clear that we're no longer living in an era in which antiquities are frequently purchased from the art market by museums. This practice has diminished in part because an increasing number of countries have become more aggressive in pursuing litigation against museums, many cases of which have been successful, as we've seen most recently with the Museum of the Bible in Washington. To this, I would add one important issue with which all curators and archaeologists grapple. The public will generally not make the effort to go to museums unless we offer the same kind of compelling narratives that are featured in movies and television. And such narratives are far easier to construct if the objects being exhibited have a known provenance. Curators are storytellers. If the object derives from a controlled excavation, one can usually determine when, where, and why it was made, and how it functioned in the societies in which it operated. If an object has no provenance other than the ancient Mediterranean, the stories that can be wrapped around it are more limited in scope, and usually confined to a discussion of the iconography, if it exists, or to the object's function in generic activities such as feasting or fighting. And sometimes with unprovenanced ancient art, narrative is eschewed altogether and set on a stage that I would describe as sterile, as this example from the Manil collection illustrates. The objects are invited to speak for themselves, but without the curator as interpreter, I'm not sure anyone hears them. Archaeologists and anthropologists have increasingly been asking a deceptively simple question. What do objects want? If I were to attempt an answer, I would say that they want their histories restored to them through the kinds of assemblages in which they're exhibited and the associated text panels that can tell their stories. What they do not want is to be appreciated only for their aesthetic qualities. We're fortunate at Penn to have a largely provenienced collection that makes such storytelling possible. But for many other museums, this means arranging long-term loans with a series of countries, which is now more difficult politically than it once was. In the end, I suppose we need to ask one fundamental question. What is the role of a museum in the 21st century? And do museums still need objects in a predominantly digital world? This, of course, was the title of a recent book by Stephen Kahn, and it's an issue with which archaeologists and curators continually wrestle. I would argue that there has never been a more urgent need for museums, but in order to remain relevant, museums need to accelerate their outreach to groups with which they have not typically engaged, and situate the objects they do have in narrative frameworks that are relevant for 21st century issues. For me, a museum is an institution that recognizes the power of objects to promote an understanding of the role of the past and the present, and resolves to extend that understanding to as many groups in society as possible. I think this image will summarize many of the points I've made this afternoon. This is a photo of the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001, which was draped with a bilingual banner after Taliban control of the city had ended. A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. Culture is the lifeblood of a nation, as I think we would all agree. And our determination to safeguard culture is a unifying force. It's only by identifying common ground among archaeologists, museum curators, and politicians that we can continue to play a transformative role in keeping culture alive, and thus the nations associated with that culture. So thank you for listening to me today, and thank you for your support of archaeology. Thank you.
So thank you, Brian. Wonderful talk. Raised so many really important and interesting issues. So I think I'll just ask that we go straight to questions. There are mics coming down both aisles, and we can also take questions from online. Yes, here we have one.
What's the recent information from Afghanistan with the Taliban having taken over again?
The problem is we don't have reliable information from Afghanistan. Looting has increased. I mean, we need to rely on satellite photography for this sort of data. Looting has increased. The number of antiquities funneled out of the country has increased. I'm sure that the plundering of archaeological sites has increased. The Kabul Archaeological Museum is still intact. There has been, from what I gather from my sources, there has been no plundering of the museum. All of the objects that traveled around the world after the Taliban's expulsion in 2001, the so-called Tila Tepe treasure, these are intact, but the state of the antiquities and of cultural heritage in general has gone down. I remember when I was in Ghazni in southern Afghanistan, and the State Department asked me to address the town council of Ghazni. So I had 100 men in front of me, all looking very serious and saying, why should we care about the preservation of pre-Islamic antiquities? Because I had been talking about cultural heritage protection. So I talked about how Ghazni would one day, not tomorrow, not in 10 years, but one day become a tourist destination. And those who came to visit the site would want to see representative examples of the greatness of past cultures, regardless of the century to which they were connected. And that at least got the attention of some of them. But this is, you're right, a difficult sell.
My question is about ongoing exploration right now. So I work in AI with deep fakes and hallucinations, things like that. We're entering a period of increasing distrust of any sort of data out there. It's really easy to fake provenance and chain of custody information. Is your organization doing anything to harden provenance and chain of custody information so that you're increasing trust as distrust increases?
You're raising a fascinating question, an important question, and one with which we have not really seriously begun to grapple. You're right, AI has changed everything in all of our lives on every level. The first thing I say in a class that I teach now is, let me tell you my policy on AI. Don't use it. I have to put it on... That works well. I have to put that on my syllabus. And AI, as you say, has changed issues surrounding provenance and repatriation requests. I'm not sure exactly how this will all pan out. In my own case in Turkey, they have embraced AI. We're encouraged to bring AI into our excavations as a way of making it more attractive to visitors, increasing the tourist industry. But you're right, there's another side to it involving repatriation. I don't know anyone who's really investigated the question that you've just posed, but I am going to propose to the AIA that they establish a task force dealing with exactly what you've just indicated. Thank you for that question.
Just a footnote to that, I suppose the silver lining, hopefully, will be that AI, with the increasing digitization of all sorts of data online, hopefully there'll be more documents, more information that might actually throw light on provenance history that we don't have direct access to today.
A good point, yeah, and conceivable. There was another question. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for coming here. Obviously, your examples and the focus of your work is on ancient, very early works, but a lot of our cultural artifacts are much more recent than that. And so I've had the privilege of addressing copyright issues as they relate to these works, and not only more recent works that are still under copyright, but even some of the publications, photographs, byproducts of your work with earlier artifacts. And I'm wondering if you have ever encountered the copyright issues in different countries, and I've had the privilege, as I say, of working with the development of copyright law around the world to accommodate making copies for preservation purposes. And I'm wondering if you've ever encountered this in your work.
I haven't ever encountered that, but if you're interested in exploring that issue in more detail, I have an associate, Peter Herdrich, who has an organization called Digital Library of the Middle East, and he has explored those copyright issues. So I'm happy to give you his contact information after this talk.
Hi there. Thank you very much for this talk. It's been very, very enlightening. I am very curious if you could shed some more light on the iconoclasm in some of these areas that are going through lots of conflict, and maybe efforts that have been taken when interacting with locals who share some of the effort to maintain these connections to the past. Maybe like any efforts that are being taken to, like, I know these represent very different groups of people, but efforts to disincentivize in iconoclasm in people who are more radical and want to destroy these things.
You raise a good question, and it goes back to my speech to the Ghazni Town Council. You have to make them stakeholders in the preservation of the cultural heritage. And the easiest way to do that is to make the cultural heritage part of the economy of the region. So if you can convince them, as I regularly try to do at the archaeological sites where I work, that preserving the antiquities will make it more attractive to visitors who will come to a village, whereas otherwise they would not have done so, and they will spend money, and that will improve the economy of the village. And I also try to bring them into lectures or into tours of the museum so that they can get money from tour groups doing that. So you try to provide an economic incentive for them to focus on preservation of the site. Now, iconoclasm is a big subject. I tried to cover both sides of it. In terms of what you leave standing, there is antiquity, and then there are the more modern examples. And there, even in this country, there is a wide variety of opinion on what should remain standing, what should remain in existence. Some would say that Silent Sam on the UNC Chapel Hill campus should have been blown up. Some would say it should have stayed where it was. Some would say it should be moved to a warehouse, others to a museum. There are examples of this sort in almost every country. I tried to give my own response to that. For me, these are historical documents. History, since the beginning of time, has been messy. History will always be messy. If we try to remove all material culture testaments to the messiness of history, we're not left with much history. So I have my own attitude toward this. As I said, if the object in question promotes injustice, then it should be removed from a public site and turned into a didactic tool in a museum. But I can't conscience the destruction of an historical document for which all of these would qualify.
Let's go to a question from the Zoom audience.
We have a couple of questions that merge and extend into what's happening today to further what you were doing. For example, are there plans to extend this training to NATO or other organizations or states taking part in war? And is the State Department now, today, doing anything in Ukraine and Palestine to help people protect cultural heritage?
Ukraine and Palestine, I just don't know. Every U.S. military base has an archaeologist. And there are now cultural heritage lectures that are recorded and played for the soldiers prior to their deployment. So the situation has become considerably more advanced than in 2003. My forays into securing approval for the troop lecture system in 2003 met with silence for the longest time. I made the mistake of writing to Donald Rumsfeld, who at the time was Secretary of Defense, and he wasn't going to answer my emails. I mean, he didn't know me from Adam. And it was only when Matthew Bogdanos told me to write to General Abizade at the US Central Command that I had any traction. And even then, I had to convince them that I wasn't a latter-day Jane Fonda, who was hell-bent on encouraging the soldiers to leave their service. And even then, they only gave me 20 minutes in pre-deployment training to do the history and archaeology of Iraq and Afghanistan and all of conservation. So, I mean, it got better. Eventually, we got a day. But, and Shelby, I've been going off on a tangent, so take me back. Oh, all right. So to what extent are people doing it today? It's being done in most countries for most soldiers. I think everybody, in nearly every country, there's a unit on cultural heritage protection. If you ask me whether or not there's one in Russia, I can't give you that answer. When I was once with the head of the Institute of Archaeology of the Russian Academy of Sciences, it was when the Russians were moving into Chechnya, and feeling emboldened by my approval by the US Central Command, I said to this gentleman who could have made it happen, let's start a troop lecture program on cultural heritage protection in Russia because your soldiers are leaving the borders of Russia for armed conflict. I was trying to keep it as neutral as possible. And he said, I think they know enough. And that was the end of the conversation. But in most countries, it is happening. And it is certainly happening on US military bases. And the State Department is very focused on this, on cultural heritage protection. I mean, they were instrumental in helping found an institute for conservation in Erbil in Kurdistan in northern Iraq, which still continues.
Is there any plans to go back to Afghanistan? I was there in February for a tour and everything seemed pretty peaceful. But for the moment, is there like other societies going there, archaeological societies, for like more investigation about the sites and the things found there?
I don't know. No one I know is digging in Afghanistan at the moment. There are, I think, although I'm not 100% certain, some Chinese archaeologists who were digging near the site of Mes Aynak, which is a mammoth copper mining area, which also contains many Buddhist monasteries with well-preserved terracotta sculpture. So I think there is some Chinese archaeological involvement in that area because the expansion of the copper mining is threatening the survival of these Buddhist monasteries. But that's the only example I know of.
There's a question that you partly answered, which is about quantifying the results of all your efforts. So just the fact that all sorts of military now get access to this kind of information is key. Are there other ways in which you have seen the good results of everything you've tried to do?
Initially, I relied on emails from people, from soldiers in the field. And so I would get not a lot, but a few every year, saying we went to an archaeological site, there were looters, we stopped it. We were digging for the continuation of our base in southern Iraq or northern Iraq or Afghanistan. And as we dug down, we noticed that the soil was changing color from brown to red. And we remembered what you told us, that when you're digging down and the soil changes from brown to red in this area, probably you're getting into the vicinity of mud bricks and a structure that's at least 2,000, conceivably 3,000 or 4,000 years old. So stop, tell your commanding officer, and make plans to dig in a different place, because otherwise you'd be destroying an ancient site. And they would say, this is exactly what happened. We saw the soil changing color. We went to our commanding officer, and we did modify our plans for expansion. So I would get some of these every year. And then eventually, some of the veterans became graduate students in ancient history at Penn. And so they would tell me that the AIA's efforts and efforts by the archaeologists at the army bases where they had trained had really come to fruition, and they were very conscious of protecting the cultural heritage of the regions. So you have to pull the information about the success of the programs from a variety of areas, but I think they have been successful.
All right, well, we've had, I think, a wonderfully informative and interesting and critical conversation about some very important heritage issues, and they're not going away. The flashpoints, the particular flashpoints may have quietened down, but the nature of history is that this issue isn't going away. So I want, on your behalf, to say a very sincere thank you to Professor Brian Rose for highlighting this incredibly important topic for us all here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.